Welcome to another edition of Developreneur. Today we are going to be talking about software development, what goes into building software. So today we're going to take a different look at software development. So in the past we've talked about things like software development, SDLC, we've talked about software test lifecycle, and we've given you kind of the benchmark or textbook descriptions on these particular topics. So to kick off a new series I will be covering soon, talking about building software from an application perspective, we're going to be building a new application from scratch, essentially a classroom app. So today my idea was to kind of go through the software development or software development as a whole from the perspective of a business, where here we are sitting at a round table and the business decides we want to build something. We want to write an app. We want to solve a problem. So we're going to cover these topics today. We're going to start with, what is our problem? Start with the problem. Break down the problem. We're going to design an application. We're going to talk about building a prototype application. We're then going to briefly cover how to test our application, and then go into deploying the application. And then finally, at the end of the cycle, handing off the project to the customer and what are the next steps. So let's start with the first concept. Here we are, we're a software company, we're an entrepreneur. We have this idea. We either have a problem that we want to solve, or we have a unique problem within the company or a feature that we need to build to service our customer. So we want to start with asking ourselves, what do we want? What is it that we need to build, or what is it that we're trying to solve? So this is kind of that first part of the software development lifecycle, that planning phase. And this is a vital role in the software development lifecycle, where we need to sit down either as a team or sit down as a group or maybe a collaboration of people and kind of walk through the ideas of what it is that we want to do. What is it that we're trying to solve? So for instance, this new series I'm going to be talking about building this classroom app. Well, this concept came from the idea of Developreneur. We have all these meetings and we talk about these presentations and the different concepts of software development, different areas in the industry, DevOps, we've talked about mobile apps. So we had a problem. So instead of us having to constantly deploy our apps out to like Vimeo or YouTube, or say we want to do a bootcamp idea, it kind of stems to the fact that maybe we should put together a classroom app idea. So from here, instead of us meeting in the real world, given the COVID and all the constraints in today's society, I was thinking, why don't we build a classroom app, a virtual app for a classroom? So that's our problem. And so now we need to sit down and define specifically what it is that we want to do. Is our classroom idea for, virtual? Is it for on-site? Do we need to have cameras? Do we need to have different, what is it that we want to do? So you start with the problem. So you start putting together the different pieces and ideas, and you kind of brainstorm what it is that you want. So once you have defined the problem, once you know what it is that you want to do, we need to break it down into smaller pieces. So we kind of need to break the problem down further. So here, we're kind of moving out of the planning phase of the software development lifecycle into that gathering requirements phase. So here, we're going to break down our idea. We're going to take this classroom app, and then we need to now break it down into its smaller pieces. For instance, do we need to have different users for our classroom? You're going to probably have presenters, you're going to have teachers, you're going to have students. And do we need to have a public facing? Are we going to open up some of our classrooms to the public where they can watch but not interact? We may need an administrator, someone to actually add users to our classroom application. Some other things we need to think about are like hardware. What type of hardware do we need? Are we going to have laptops for this classroom? Do we need to have any specific requirements for the instructor or the student? What type of operating systems do we need to worry about if we're building a desktop application? Is this a web application? And if so, what type of browsers are you going to support? Is this going to be for, mobile or web? So are you going to need to be supporting tablets and cell phone? Other things you need to think about or breaking down are, what are some of the security constraints? Do we need to have a login? Or do we need to, make sure we have those SSL certificates if we're on the web so that we can be accessible through web browsers? What type of data storage features do we need? Are we going to have a cloud-based storage, or do we need to have any storage repositories, set up specifically GitHub or Bitbucket repositories? Other things to think about once you've kind of defined the functionality or the components of the problem, you now need to break it down even further. So if we're looking to build a classroom application and we say we want to make it a web or even a desktop application, what is it going to look like? How is it going to how's the user going to interact with this application? So we're going to probably need things like a login page, a dashboard, maybe a profile so the student or the instructor can upload photos and some information and contacts on how to reach them. We might want to have a lesson book or workbooks for the students where we can assign tasks or do in-class assignments. Maybe it's some type of scheduler for integrating with different calendars, a media manager, possibly even a news and a blog feature. And then some other things to think about. So we've covered from a feature-esque problem. So we broke it down into the different roles. We've talked about some of the features. We've talked about some of the modules we could build. We also talked about some of the devices we could support. Now we need to also think about what type of languages or what type of architectures do we want to use to build our software. So in this breaking down of the problem, this is where we also want to look at, okay, what type of resources do we have at our disposal? Are we a brand new company? Do we have any tech resources? Do we have anyone with any software development skills? If not, then what do we need to look for when we go out and hire people? Do we need web-based developers? Meaning, do they have HTML, JavaScript, CSS support? Do we need to build something that has a back-end support? So do we need to have C#? Do we need to have Java? Do we need to have PHP, Perl, Python? Some of those things. And then some of the other things you need to think about, not just from a programming language perspective, but you also need to think about possibly data storage. So now we could be getting into databases. So now you may need to have some type of database architecture. Do you need to have like MySQL? Do you need to have Oracle, Postgres? And then what type of tools and things do you need with that? And then you need break it down just a little bit further from that. Then you start thinking about, okay, now here are all the individual problems. So now we need to start breaking them down further. So now what do we need to do? Do we need to go hire some developers, or do we have the developers we need? Do we need to hire some testers to actually start testing the apps that we're building? Do we need to go buy physical devices, get those mobile phones, get those desktops, tablets, things like that? At this phase, we need to think about those as we break down the problem. So these are just some of the things to think about as you break down the problem or during that requirements gathering phase of the software development cycle. So now once you've discussed the problem, once you define what it is that you're trying to build, and you've broken down all the individual components for how it is that you want to actually build, design, and put this together, you now have to go through and figure out what you want the application to look like. So for our classroom application, do we want, so say we want to build this as a web application. So is it going to be mobile facing? Are we going to have two different versions, a browser based and a handheld face, or just the web version only? Specifically what type of devices do we want? So once we know the devices and then we start designing the application, we need to make sure that we articulate the user interface or the interactively to our applications to be user friendly. So we want to make sure what we build not only meets our problem or meets the need of the organization or the shareholders, but we also want to make sure that it is a good, fun, easy to use customer experience for the end user. So during the design phase of the application, this is where you're going to kind of storybook out the screen. You're going to kind of do some wire diagrams, put them together here, and then you're going to take those diagrams and you're going to go out and actually start building the application. If you do it right and you do these wireframes up front, you're going to reduce the back and forth time between you and the end user and the requirement, which will help reduce the amount of time it takes to get to market, and it will help cut down on any mistakes that might be overlooked during the design phase. Also, in the design phase, when you're looking to build the look and feel of your application, you want to think to yourself, what do we want to be when we're all grown up? So you take the concept from the idea, take it from the requirements, and then you take the individual components, and then again you go back and you think to yourself, okay, what do we want it to look like at the end? So it's kind of a cohesive process as you're going through this. So these are just some things you're going to think about as you're designing your application. Next, once you've gone through the first 3 phases of the software development lifecycle, planning, requirements gathering, design, now we want to actually build the prototype. Now we're going to put the pieces together. We are going to take all those different components that we need and slowly start building them out. Now, if we have done our due diligence and we have laid out all the different components that we needed from the beginning, then when we get to this piece, we are going to have a pretty good roadmap for what it is that we need to build. So we can take all those pieces and we put them together. Now, if we did not do a good job in the beginning phases of our design process, we're going to run into things like scope creep, or we're going to start running into longer development and build times trying to put things together because we overlook things, which can increase the cost of our development time. So if we're trying to get something to market quickly, we really need to make sure that we've done our due diligence and broken down those pieces. For instance, we don't want to start building our classroom app and then come to the point where we're ready to present and realize that we forgot the login, we forgot the role-based security. So we now cannot distinguish between that instructor versus the student. So now everyone sees all the solutions, not to mention the content. So, whoops, we don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you've done your due diligence and that you have put together all the pieces first. So when you get to this point, you just build out the prototype, you get something quick and easy, you start building the front-end user phase, people can start interacting with it, and then you start building the back-end pieces. Next, we get into testing. So as I have here, we want to test. So how do we avoid that crash and burn? So during the software cycle, as we're testing our applications, as we're building the applications, we want to make sure that we have someone there that is testing as each of the features slowly roll out. This way, we can actually catch things before we get to the end user. So we get into that agile style of development where, okay, we develop a task, we quickly test. If there's a problem, we roll it back, we fix it, and move forward. So we go through that continuous cycle. While we're testing, we're going to be looking for some other things throughout the process. So not only as we prototype this, we're going to be looking at the different ways we want to test the software. So if this is a web-based application, if we're doing any type of software development, the developers should have some level of testing built into their applications. They need to be doing some type of unit testing. That way we know from a development perspective when things break, when the code changes. As we roll into the user interface testing, the actual manual testing, we need to start looking at the different types of testing tools that we need to test our application. For instance, if we're dealing with a web-based application, we can use the browser developer tools to test our applications. We can use Selenium to write web-based tests to test our applications. We can use record playback tools like the Selenium IDE. We can use Sauce Labs, or we can use Browser Stack to test our applications. If we are dealing with a mobile app, we may have to look at using things like Appium, or depending upon the language tool you're using, you might be able to use some additional testing tools for testing your mobile applications. If you're a desktop application, you run into some additional risks with that, but there are still some tools out there that allow you to test desktop applications depending on the operating system. So here at this level, we're doing that software testing. So if we're walking through the through the classroom application, here we're going to want to think about those different components. So we want to test, okay, do we have that login screen? Are we testing, how are we testing the application? Are we testing it for functionality? Are we testing it from a student's perspective? Are we testing it from an instructor's perspective? Are we testing this from the administrator's perspective? Meaning they are the person that just goes in and sets up users' accounts and roles. Whereas if you're the instructor, you want to be able to come into the application and actually set up a new class, add students, add workbooks, add assignments, and so on. And if you're the student, you want to make sure you can log into the applications, see the different courses you're registered for, see your progress in the course, and be able to go in, watch the classes, do the assignments, or possibly take tests.